Occult activity. Even though we live in a culture that de-emphasizes occult activity, we must take seriously the reality that demonic and evil forces exist. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
Here's the text, and Moses gets very specific here. Deuteronomy 18, verse 9. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. Now, the detestable customs relate to demonic activity. We read on, no one among you is to make his son or daughter pass through the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a familiar spirit, or inquire of the dead. That's evil. It's detestable. Everyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. And the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable things. This is one reason God had no mercy at this point. He had had mercy for hundreds of years on all of these incredible crimes against humanity, even offering their own children as sacrifices to the demons. That was the kind of culture the Canaanites had degenerated into. And that was the kind of culture that permeated the world. There was none righteous, no, not one. And it was a horrible situation. So you must be blameless before the Lord your God. And he goes on, though these nations you're about to drive out listen to fortune tellers and diviners, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. In other words, we are not to have any association whatsoever with demonic activity, anything that is related to the occult. And that's a kind of culture that existed then and even in the New Testament world. When Paul came to Ephesus, they worshiped evil, demons, and the gospel penetrated that great city of Ephesus. And basically, here we have a statement in Acts chapter 19, verses 18 and 19. Here are the people who came to Christ in Ephesus, and many who had become believers came confessing and disclosing their practices. What were those practices? Well, Luke explains. While many of those who had practiced magic, the specific practice of magic, the occult activities, they collected their books, they burned them in front of everyone, so they calculated their value and found it to be 50,000 pieces of silver. They had a bonfire worth 50,000 pieces of silver. And one day I calculated what that meant in our economy today, and it would have been over $5 million of occult books. That's a bonfire. And that's one reason why there was such threat for those who were making these little silver shrines and worshiping the temple of Diana and all that. They were threatened by that, and they turned the whole city against Paul because it cut into the profits of those who were involved in divination, in demonology. And so the gospel penetrated that culture and brought some pretty severe repercussions. And that's why, if you understand that background, then you understand Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul said to the Ephesian believers and to, I believe, the other churches in Asia, because the Ephesian letter probably was a circular letter that went to Ephesus and then was circulated to Philadelphia and Smyrna and Thyatira and these other cities of Asia that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, because from those areas they came to Ephesus. You read about that. They came from all over Asia to worship in the temple of Diana. So this was a very centralized area where demonology was very, very prevalent. And so when Paul wrote to these believers, he says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world powers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces evil in the heavens. These people were converted out of this. And so they needed to know that they needed to put on the full armor of God to withstand all of that evil that existed, not just in Ephesus, but throughout Asia. and a very practical passage. And once you read Ephesians against the backdrop of the story in the book of Acts, then you understand why Paul was really concerned about this whole area of evil in that culture. Satan, of course, is behind all activities that are out of the will of God. So the question we need to think about is, what are some of the more subtle forms of demonic activity in our culture today, and why should we avoid any involvement? Well, let me just read for you what Paul said about the lust of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5, the works of the flesh that are evil. Now, the works of the flesh are obvious. And I want you to notice what comes first: sexual immorality, moral impurity, promiscuity. And then he follows that with idolatry and sorcery. You see, if you read through the Old Testament, there was a very close connection between pagan worship and immorality. In fact, the two were intertwined. You go into the New Testament, to Corinth, to Ephesus, immorality, idolatry were intertwined. So by implication, where you have promiscuity, you have sexual immorality, moral impurity, you have Satan lurking behind that activity. He is the author of that kind of activity. In our culture, it can be very subtle. And those of us who are believers who take a stand against this, we don't understand. You know, we're living by an old standard that is no longer relevant. Where have you been? And you're not in touch with reality. And you watch talk shows today, you watch even those that would be considered sophisticated. Behind that is satanic activity. And if you really want to see an illustration of postmodern thinking, what you need to do is to listen to the rationalizations of individuals who justify immorality and say, this is my truth, they have their truth, but my truth is not in contradiction to their truth because I'm doing what I believe is right. And there's been recently some statements like that just boggled your mind in terms of rationalization of immorality, even breaking up homes and not taking responsibility for what that has done. So it's happening in our culture today. And behind that is occult activity. Not overtly, but it's there because Satan is behind all of these works of the flesh, which are listed in this passage. He goes on to talk about hatred, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambitions, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, anything similar. All relates back to satanic influence, though it may be covert rather than overt. Occult activity. Even though we may live in a culture that de-emphasizes occult activity, we must take seriously the reality that demonic and evil forces exist.